Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Mohab Shanash. I am a second year medical student, and today I will be explaining to you the anterior and posterior pituitary hormones, inshallah. I've also integrated a lot of aspects from Dr. Yaqeen's lecture because I felt like it was important for your understanding. So let's begin. This is my contact information in case you want to reach out or have any questions. So, very first thing, what is the pituitary? The pituitary is an endocrine gland. It secretes hormones. Now, why is it important? Because the hormones that the pituitary secretes controls all the other glands that you have. So here's our structure. The pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus, which is a part of your brain. Okay, your hypothalamus has your pituitary stalk. Pituitary stalk connects to your hypophysis. Hypophysis is another name to the pituitary. Now, the anterior pituitary has three different segments. The pars tuberalis, which you can remember because it is close to the tube here, okay, or the pituitary stalk. You have your pars intermedia because it's intermediate, and then you have your pars distalis. Okay. Here's what I want you to know from this. Okay, the most important thing is that your anterior pituitary comes from something called Rathke's pouch. Okay, that's something they ask about, and you should know very well. Okay, moving on. Awesome. Sorry. One other thing, you have something called the diencephalon. The diencephalon is mostly involved with your brain. Okay. However, it also does give you your posterior pituitary. Now, your posterior pituitary does have a connection with the hypothalamus through nerves. Okay, so your diencephalon, as such, does end up making your posterior pituitary. Now, here is a more detailed figure from what I've already talked about. Okay, so your anterior pituitary, you have your pars tuberalis close to your tube, pars intermediate, your pars distalis because it is distal. Okay, now your pars distalis because it is distal. Now, your pars distalis is where all your hormones get secreted. Okay, so it also has another name, your anterior lobe as a whole. It's called the adenohypophysis. So from what you can see here, your adenohypophysis starts with A, your anterior lobe starts with A. That's an easy way to remember. Your neurohypophysis, okay, like I said before, and I mentioned previously, your posterior pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus with neurons, okay? So that your pituitary is also called your infundibulum. Now, as I progress through this health session, I'll be using different names just to help orient you and get you used to them, okay? Now, what are the neurons that come to the posterior pituitary? You have the paraventricular hypothalamic nucleus, which is next to the ventricles of the brain. And then you have your supraoptic hypothalamic nucleus because it's above your optic chiasm. Now, a nucleus is just a collection of cell bodies in your central nervous system. So here is a histology slide. Very, very simply, how you can remember this. Your posterior has nerves, so it's white. Your anterior has secretory granules, so that's why it's darker. This is how you can easily identify them, okay? Now, we should look at some relations to the pituitary. Above it, we have something called the optic chiasm. This is involved with your vision, okay? Below it, you have something called the sella turcica, okay? Sella turcica is basically a groove in the sphenoid bone. Sphenoid bone is part of your nose, and so it's in the roof of your nose, and then that's where the pituitary sits inside of it, okay? Now, why is this important? Because they do have clinical relevance. So in case of compression of the optic chiasm, this one, you can get something called bitemporal hemianopia. So a patient with bitemporal hemianopia would not be able to see anything in their periphery, okay? They just see centrally. Now, as they see centrally, so what they'd come with, for example, they'd be smacking into tables, they just can't see around them, or they're not very well oriented. And something that could commonly cause a compression of the optic chiasm are tumors, okay? So you want to get rid of a tumor. Obviously, you're not going to open up your brain, get rid of it just to get to the pituitary, which is at the very base of it. So a much easier method is to go through the nose, have an incision in the sphenoid, and deal with whatever we need to deal with through our nose. And that's called our transsphenoidal approach. Now, if you can see here, this is another histo slide with the addition of all the structures that we've talked about. So posterior pituitary, it's whiter and it's what connects to the brain, as you can see here, just goes above. And then this is our hypothalamus, and this is our optic chiasm. If we have a problem with our optic chiasm or a compression, we get the bitemporal hemianopia. Suppose it's a tumor, how do we get rid of it? Here we have our sella we just go up and then we get rid of it. So this is a MRI of our brain. I'm gonna help get you very oriented to this very easily, okay? You look at this, there's a dark spot here. This is air. If you see a dark spot in an MRI, that is air. Where would air be found? In your nose. So this is part of your sphenoid sinus. Now, we said that the pituitary sits within the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, okay? The sphenoid bone is here, okay? It's just this boundary, okay? Now, this white part, this is our pituitary. If you can see here, this is our infundibulum or our pituitary stalk, which connects us to the hypothalamus. It looks like an onion, okay? Honestly, okay? Which should help, when you look at it, you know it. So this is the same thing pretty much, just in a different view. So once again, look at the dark spot. This is our sphenoid sinus. Right above it, that would be our pituitary. And we go up a bit more, we have our optic chiasm. Both of them are a bit light. So this is what a tumor in your pituitary would look like. So this is what if you see this, how we treat it, transsphenoidal approach. So although this may look very threatening in the beginning, it's actually pretty simple. So if you look at this, you have, okay, how do we explain this? You have your hypothalamus, okay? Your hypothalamus releases hormones that go down to your anterior pituitary and make it release its hormones. Now, to do that, we need a connection between them, and that's what our hypophyseal portal network is for. Now, I'm going to break this down very simply. But before that, we need a quick review of very basic CVP, okay? You have your arteries, then you have your capillaries, then you have your veins. Any exchange that happens in your capillary plexus. So your capillary plexus, hormones want to get in or out. That's where that happens. So your hypophyseal portal system starts with your internal carotid, gives us the superior hypophyseal artery, okay? Which I'm gonna start from now. If you have something that's superior, okay, that means there is an inferior version of it. If you have something long, then you have something short. If you have, this is the point, like as long as you get the principle. You have, if it's mentioned, then there's a reason it's mentioned. So your superior hypophyseal artery gives us your primary plexus. This is still in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releasing hormones, okay? The releasing hormones are what go to the pituitary. So the primary plexus, source of exchange, releasing hormones sent out here. Primary plexus goes through your long portal veins because it has to go through the hypothalamus to the pituitary, to the secondary plexus. Secondary plexus, as this is where your stimulating hormones get released. Okay, your stimulating hormones, when they get released in the secondary plexus, they have two options. They either go through the hypophyseal vein, which sends them to the rest of the body, or the short portal vein, which sends it back to the hypothalamus to sort of have a feedback loop. Okay, and I'll go into detail as to what our feedback loops are. Now, we have the superior hypophyseal artery here. This is what I've explained just in the diagram, just so you get a better point. I'm emphasizing on this because if you get this and if you get how it works, the rest of this lecture, inshallah, will be easy for you. Superior hypophyseal artery goes here in the hypothalamus, gives us the primary plexus. Primary plexus hormones, releasing hormones, get released here, which go through the long portal veins. The long portal veins go down, make a secondary plexus. So we have a primary plexus, long portal vein, secondary plexus. Secondary plexus has two options. goes to the hypophyseal veins to the rest of the body, or we have our short portal veins, which sends it back to the hypothalamus for feedback. Now I'm going to be talking about our hormones. We have our anterior pituitary and our posterior pituitary. Each of them make their own different set of hormones. Actually, the posterior doesn't make hormones, it releases them, and I'll get into what that is, or what I mean. For the anterior, you have your growth hormone, your prolactin, your adrenocorticotropic hormone, your gonadotropins, your luteinizing hormone, and your follicle stimulating hormone, and your TSH. What does that mean? Okay, I'm gonna get into each one of them, but there's a distinction that I need to make. Okay, the distinction that I need to make is that ACTH, LH, FSH, TSH, they're trophic hormones. What I mean by trophic hormones is that they're secreted from the pituitary, they go to other glands, and they make them secrete their hormones. However, growth hormone and prolactin, they have direct action on the places that they impact. Okay, so it's not that they go somewhere and then they cause other hormones to get released. No, they do their own function. So now we're gonna explain our axis. So with any hormone, you have it starts at the hypothalamus. A hormone gets released from the hypothalamus, which causes it to get released from the pituitary. The pituitary hormone goes to the peripheral gland and causes it to release another hormone. Like, what that does is we need a balance. Obviously, we can't have too much of a hormone or not enough. So this is the function. When the peripheral gland releases its hormone, it goes back to the pituitary and back to the hypothalamus and tells them to, okay, calm down. I've done my job. I've released all we need. So please lower it. I don't need to release anymore. Your pituitary goes back to your hypothalamus in a short loop. Okay, your short loop is, for example, the hormone released from your pituitary goes to your hypothalamus, tells it to stop. Same concept. It's just that when it starts from your peripheral gland, it's a long loop. When it starts from your pituitary, it's a short loop. Now, here's the thing. If we have a peripheral gland, okay, we have a peripheral gland. If we have a problem with a peripheral gland, it's called a primary endocrine disease. Okay, so this is where it starts for the diseases. Okay, pituitary, it's our secondary endocrine disease. Hypothalamus, tertiary endocrine disease. Now, although this is where we start, what, 1, 2, 3, in terms of diseases, this is how we go, the opposite way around. Now, this is important. As you go up each level, so from primary to secondary or secondary to tertiary, the danger level gets higher. Now, let's have a little activity, okay? I'm gonna give you certain cases, and in your head, now, I want you to tell me what you think the problem could be. Start off, thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, gets released from the pituitary. T4 gets released from the peripheral gland. What they do, I'll get into later. However, just know that's where they get from for the purposes of this activity, okay? So if your TSH is high and your T4 is low, what that means is 1, 2, 3. Okay, you have a problem with your primary endocrine or your peripheral gland. Okay, a primary endocrine disease. So your pituitary is releasing the hormones it needs to release. It goes to the peripheral gland. When it goes to the peripheral gland doesn't do its job. Now, this could be due to two reasons. Either the peripheral gland isn't capable of making its hormone, or it doesn't have the receptors for the pituitary hormone. Now, if our TSH is high and our T4 is high, what do you think the problem could be? 1, 2, 3. It could be a secondary endocrine disease or tertiary. Now, secondary means it's part of a problem with the pituitary. Tertiary means it's a problem with the hypothalamus. So, TSH is high. Pituitary is doing its job. T4 is high. Peripheral gland is doing its job. So you might ask, what's the problem? Problem is, pituitary is doing its job too well. What that means, like we said, we have a long feedback loop. The pituitary isn't taking the hormone that we release from a peripheral gland and realizing that, okay, we need to stop. It's not doing that. On the other hand, the hypothalamus could be releasing too much releasing hormone, which tells the pituitary to, okay, we need more. Keep going, keep going, keep going. So this, when both of them are high, you have a problem with the feedback loops. If TSH is low and your T4 is low, this is a secondary endocrine disease. It could be tertiary too, but the main problem is with our pituitary, because in this case, the pituitary isn't releasing stimulating hormone. Now, once again, you have two reasons. Either the pituitary isn't capable of releasing the hormones, or the hypothalamus isn't releasing its releasing hormones. Okay, TSH is low and T4 is high. In that case, the pituitary realizes that we don't need more. What doesn't realize it is the periphery. So it autonomously secretes the hormones it needs. Okay. Now, this could either be just because it's autonomously secreting it, or we could have a tumor that's secreting that hormone. Now, we're going to go into our anterior pituitary hormones, okay? Or our adenohypophysis. To start off, we have our thyroid stimulating hormone, our alpha GSU, or our beta TCH, and our beta TCH. That's what it's made up of. An alpha subunit, a beta subunit. Now, our alpha subunit is the base of the structure, okay? It's found in TCH, LH, luteinizing hormone, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. So our alpha GSU is in three of those. I'm emphasizing on this because it came as a question before where they asked which one of these has alpha and beta subunits. These three. Beta TSH is exclusive for TSH. Now, here's what I want to tell you. If you're going to know anything from this lecture, you've got to know what releases this hormone and where it's released from. Okay, this is very important. Anything else is likely to be elaborated on in other lectures, but as a basis, you need to know these two. Okay, so you have thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. This goes to your thyrotropes. As you can see, it's just very easy. The names are thyro. Okay, so TRH goes to your thyrotropes. Your thyrotropes releases TSH. Now, TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. So very basically, or very simply from the name, you can infer it goes to the thyroid. The thyroid releases T3 and T4. What T3 and T4 do and how it happens, well, you have two complete lectures just on them, okay? Now, TSH is responsible for the cellular function and growth of the thyroid. So TSH goes to your thyroid and makes the cells proliferate and get bigger, okay? Which in future instances, you'll know that if you have too much TSH, you'll have a massive bulge on your neck that's caused by it. Now, T3 and T4, it just increases your cardiac output. Now, what is your release pattern? Okay. A release pattern is basically when the hormone gets secreted in the highest concentration or the biggest amount of the hormone is secreted. Now, for TSH, it's a light dark pattern or a diurnal pattern. You could have a diurnal pattern that's activity based or a diurnal pattern that's light dark. For TSH, it's light dark. So you go out at night, your body processes that. Okay, this is dark. We're at night. Thyroid stimulating hormone gets released. Okay, if it's light, it's gotta get released, but just not as much. Now, I'm not gonna get into what GQ and GS is because that is an entire mole lecture. My friend Eileen has done a PAL session on it, so you could refer back to that if you want to get into the details. As a general concept, GQ and GS both cause increased calcium, okay? Just through different mechanics. GS is in your TSH, so same letters, so that could help you memorize it. Cyclic AMP increases your protein kinase A, okay? That causes then increased calcium. IP3 and DAG leads to increased calcium. So these are our loops. Thyroid goes back. You have your long loop. T3, T4 go to the pituitary and hypothalamus, tell it to calm down. Don't need more. Pituitary secretes TSH that goes back to your hypothalamus and tells it, I don't need more. Now you have your adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay, this is also through a GS pathway. Like I said, just cyclic AMP, PKA, increased calcium. Now, unlike thyroid stimulating hormone, instead of two subunits combining, ACTH is actually a product of one thing or a preparal hormone getting separated. So POMC or propimelanocortin divides into adrenocorticotropic hormone and beta lipotropin. Okay, how does that happen? So you have your corticotropin releasing hormone from your hypothalamus. It goes to your corticotropes. Okay, Now, keep in mind tropes here because this is going to help you distinguish it from somatotropes and lactotropes later on. Okay, corticotropes. Okay, corticotropes make POMC, which then gets cleaved into ACTH and beta lipoprotein, like lipotropin, like I mentioned. Now, ACTH, where does it go? It goes to your adrenal gland in your cortex. So adrenal gland, cortex. And what that does is your cortisol, your corticosterone, that's how they get produced. And you know, your adrenal gland, you're always stressed. If someone's always stressed, they all say, oh, your cortisol is high, whatever, etc. You know? We also have our DHEA. Our DHEA is produced in the medulla and it is a precursor to your androgens. So your testosterone and your estrogen, this is their precursor. Now, ACTH, to have a function on the adrenal gland, it goes ahead and binds to a receptor called MC2R. Okay, so ACTH, MC2R, then your adrenal gland does its work or releases cortisol and corticosterone. Now, this is diurnal, okay? Activity based. Suppose you wake up in the morning, you have an exam, you're stressed. This is how you can memorize it. When you wake up, you're stressed because ACTH is in its highest production or release during the morning. Okay. Now, I said during the morning because this is when most people wake up. However, if someone works shifts and it's the opposite way around, where they wake up at night and they sleep during the day, ACTH would be higher during night because that's when they woke up. Now, suppose you have a patient. Yeah, this patient, he comes to you. He is really tired, maybe depressed, and he's lost a lot of weight. What that does, and one more thing, he has hyperpigmentation on his hand, his feet, and in his mouth, for example. You don't need to know this picture. I've put it just so you get a clear understanding of what's going on. This is something called Addison's disease. In Addison's disease, you have high ACTH. When you have high ACTH, this is what happens. Okay, and not only is your ACTH high, you have increased beta lipotropin. Now, I said that ACTH binds to MC2R. In case of Addison's disease, because it is so high, or our ACTH concentration is really high, it also binds to MC1R. You need a high concentration of ACTH to bind to MC1R. Okay. Now, both of these together, they help with the position of melanocytes, which gives you darker skin color, or what's in the photo. Now, this is our loop, our long loop. Cortisol from the adrenal gland goes to the pituitary hypothalamus, tells it to calm down. Pituitary, ACTH, short loop, tells it to calm down. Very simple. Now, here's what's different. Now, you're someone that's stressed, okay? Your cortisol is going to get high. And your body recognizes that I need more cortisol. Like this is not enough cortisol for me. So what happens? Your feedback loop gets inhibited. You produce cortisol, but it can't go back, or your pituitary and your hypothalamus don't recognize that, okay, this is enough, because your body needs to adapt to your stress. Okay, now this happens, it can go back to its baseline at a certain point if it's short term, like I said, like stress. However, if you have something long term, such as pregnancy or depression, where you have a lot of cortisol all the time, what happens is your hypothalamus and pituitary need to make up for it, because at some point, the normal level of cortisol just doesn't do it for you. The same way, for example, if you've heard of anyone doing drugs, they always start doing more and more and more because they develop tolerance. This is the same concept. If you have long-term stress or depression or pregnancy, your normal cortisol dose won't do it for you, so you need more. Okay, so your set point gets higher. And this leads to a tertiary endocrine disease, because, like I said, your hypothalamus is just releasing CRH all the time. Now, your gonadotropins. Your gonadotropins are your luteinizing hormone and your follicle stimulating hormone. Now, they are very similar. However, they are not released at the same time or from the same cells. They just do similar structures to your gonads. Okay. So gonadotropins, like I've told you before, nearly like it's similar to TSH. It has an alpha subunit, a beta subunit. Now, your alpha subunit is part of your TSH, LH, FSH, beta. They didn't mention it. Beta, whatever, doesn't matter. You don't need to know it. So, how are your FSH and LH released? Your gonadotropin releasing hormone go to your anterior pituitary, and it's different for each, your FSH and LH. In this lecture, they were mentioned that this you'll know a lot more about FSH and LH in your repro section of the block. Okay, now your FSH and LH, when they're released from their cellular source, they go to the ovaries and the testes. Okay, when they go to the ovaries and the testes, they stimulate them to release estrogen and testosterone. Now, this is called steroidogenesis. Estrogen and testosterone, they are important for gametogenesis. Okay. Now, gametogenesis is basically the development of sperm and eggs. If this is impaired, then the process of gametogenesis will also be impaired. Gonadotropin releasing hormone follows a G stimulatory and a GQ pathway, so both of them. Now, here's our feedback loops. Very simple. Estrogen and testosterone from the gonads inhibit hypothalamus and pituitary. Pituitary, LH, and FSH go back and inhibit it. Now, here is something special, okay? And this is different. For FSH, you have something called inhibin. Inhibin is unique for FSH. It's not both LH and FSH. And it's also unique to the pituitary. So it doesn't function as a hypothalamus. It's just the pituitary. So inhibin released or for FSH to the pituitary and tells it to stop. Okay, inhibin is a tissue growth factor. So if they ask you a question and they say, "Oh, which tissue growth factor inhibits FSH?" you could say inhibin. And if they say, "Oh, what is a special molecule for FSH to be inhibited?" it's inhibin. Now, I want you to imagine this case with me. Okay, you have a male patient who is 18, and although he is at the point where he should be experiencing puberty or has gone through it, he doesn't have puberty. And loss of smell. If you get these two, no puberty and loss of smell, just know what you're dealing with is Kalman syndrome. Hypogonadotropic hypogonadism. LH and FSH aren't getting released from the pituitary, so hypogonadotropic. And then because of that, estrogen and testosterone are not getting released. Hypogonadism, okay, which basically means which ends up you don't experience puberty, your sexual organs may not be properly developed, and you may see this in a infant if their testes are undescended. Okay. Now I said male patient here. It's most commonly in males. Okay. However, it could also occur in females. So no puberty, loss of smell, Kalman syndrome. Also. Now growth hormone. Now I've already mentioned growth hormone and prolactin are not trophic hormones. They don't go and stimulate something else to make another hormone. No, they do their own job, okay? And that is through the JAK-STAT pathway. JAK-STAT pathway, also again, mole, but all you need to know is hormone attaches, goes to the nucleus, and impacts the nucleus, which causes the functional changes that we need. Now, growth hormone is not functionally, structurally similar to prolactin and human placental lactogen, okay? So they're structurally similar to both of them, and there is actually an overlap in their function. Okay. Now, growth hormone releasing hormone, okay, goes to your somatotropes. Notice this time, it's not trophs, okay? It's somatotrope because it does its own work. So somatotropes go ahead and releases our growth hormone. Our growth hormone goes to the liver and helps it produce insulin growth factor, pretty much. Okay. Now, it doesn't only do that. However, that is the pathway that you need to know. Okay, and I'll tell you other functions of what it does in a bit. Okay. Now, we have a growth hormone carrier protein or a growth hormone binding protein. Okay, this is basically something that just helps the growth hormone not get degraded. Always, if you have something attached to a carrier protein, it's going to have a longer half-life or longer survivability in your body. Now, you will not have growth hormone binding protein in Laron syndrome. Okay. Now, Laron syndrome is a type of dwarfism. Okay. Laron syndrome. You don't have the receptors that growth hormone bind to, and your growth hormone binding protein or the carrier protein is derived from these receptors. Okay, I'm gonna get into the clinical implications of this in a bit, but just know you don't have carrier proteins in Layne syndrome, and you also have insulin growth factor 1 carrier protein or IGF binding protein. Also, growth hormone diurnal, or it's activity based. Growth hormone is mostly released during sleep. This is why it's so important for children to have proper sleep, because this is when they most grow. This is when their growth hormone um, is most active. Growth hormone peaks at puberty. Makes sense because that is the period of highest growth. Now, just the same way, since Ramadan is coming up, just the same way you are different before iftar and after iftar, your growth hormone is different. Now, when you're fed, you depend on protein more. Keep this in mind. You need, like, you use protein, you make RNA, you uptake protein more. Okay. If you're starving, that means you're likely have a depleted protein storage, okay, or protein source. So you depend on your glucose. If you understand these 2 points, you pretty much understand all of this. Okay. So let's take step by step. Adipose tissue. If you're starving, you're not gonna uptake glucose as much, and you're gonna have more lipolysis. So you're gonna get less fat. Okay. When you're starving, you get less fat. MashaAllah. Okay. Because you need glucose circulating around in your body. Okay. For your liver, okay, you get more RNA synthesis because you have enough proteins to do that when you're well fed. You more insulin growth factor because you're producing growth hormone that goes to your liver and its function. Okay. So you eat food, you're well fed, more insulin growth factor. Now, if you're starving, you'll have gluconeogenesis. Now, in muscles, if you're starving, you'll have less glucose uptake. Once again, you uptake less glucose when you're starving because you need it circulating around to work. However, if you're well fed, you go to the gym, you're eating properly, you're hitting your protein, you have more amino acid uptake, and more protein synthesis because you have a source of protein to depend on. Okay. Now, here's where overlap is. You have insulin growth factor, and you have increased cell size and number in connective tissue. Now, this is where it overlaps with um, prolactin. No, wait, I apologize. Forget what I just said. I had a brain fart. Moving on. Now, I'm not going to give you our normal feedback loop because I thought this was much more interesting. Growth hormone is pretty much our, okay? You have your growth hormone releasing hormone telling your body, make more. I need more growth hormone, okay? And then you have your insulin growth factor released by the liver, which tells your body, no, I have enough. Okay. And you have two more players in this game. You have your ghrelin and you have your somatostatin. Your ghrelin, to me, sounds like the sound your stomach makes when it's hungry. Okay. So in that case, your body is going to need more growth hormone. Okay. Your ghrelin release in cases where you're full. Okay. Just pause it. Doesn't more growth hormone. I need that. Somatostatin is the opposite way around. Somatotropes, like I said, that's what releases our growth hormone. Statin sounds like static. So stops the somatotropes from releasing growth hormone. So this is basically what I said just in this, our normal form. You have liver, goes back as producer IGF, goes back pituitary and hypothalamus. Then you have less growth hormone, less GHRH, and more somatostatin. So somatostatin is released by IGF-1 or when IGF-1 is produced. Then you have growth hormone releasing hormone, and gonadotropin releasing hormone. Oh yes, growth hormone inhibits not only growth hormone releasing hormone and your gonadotropin releasing hormone. So your LH and FSH aren't inhibited by your growth hormone. So you have two things that inhibit your gonadotropin: the gonadotropins themselves and your growth hormones. So imagine you have a patient. Okay? Patient comes to you. He has a lot of linear growth. What do I mean linear growth? Everything is growing equally. So he has large arms, large legs, his body and torso are like everything is equal. Okay, this happens when you have increase in growth hormone before puberty. This is because you have something called your epiphyseal plates. Your epiphyseal plates are where you grow or your bones grow. Now, as puberty occurs and after puberty, your epiphyseal plates stop producing and it just stops. Before that, it has the capability to accept growth hormone and grow more. So in this case, this is what you get. You get gigantism. Now, in another case, if you get increased growth hormone after puberty, so you have someone that was previously normal, they experienced puberty, they grew normally, and then they get a growth hormone excess, so they start getting disfigured features, coarse, their hands are rough, their jawline is protruding. This is called acromegaly. Okay, acromegaly is growth hormone excess after what's it called? Puberty. And honestly, gigantism just sounds to me, and it's smoother. For example, so gigantism is easier to say on the tongue. Acromegaly is coarser, it's harsher, and that's, for example, when I was studying, that's how I remembered it. Now, if you don't have enough growth hormone, you have dwarfism. Now, normal dwarfism, you don't have enough growth hormone, could be treated if you give the patient growth hormone. However, like I told you before, if you have Laren's dwarfism, you don't have the receptors. So the problem isn't pituitary, the problem is with the receptors. So even if you give the patient growth hormone, it will not have an impact. And because you don't have the growth hormone receptors, you don't have the growth hormone binding protein, which I told you is derived from our growth hormone receptors. Now, prolactin, JAK STAT pathway, same thing as growth hormone because it does its own job. Now, what is the inhibiting hormone? The inhibiting hormone for prolactin is dopamine. Unlike everything else, and I told you before, in the hypothalamus, when something is released, what's released is a releasing hormone, except one thing, prolactin inhibiting hormone, which is dopamine. And I'll help give you an example to remember this more, okay? Then you have your cellular source. You have your lactotrope. So this stops lactotropes from producing prolactin. Okay, not helps it produce it, it stops it. So dopamine stops lactotropes from producing prolactin. Dopamine stops getting released, lactotropes produces prolactin. And what prolactin helps with is development of breasts. It's involved in pregnancy. It's involved in lactation and galactopoiesis. Now, lactation, not ejection. The production of milk is by prolactin. The ejection of it or the process of giving it to the child is not by prolactin. Galactopoiesis is basically maintaining lactation. Now, the pattern is diurnal in those not breastfeeding. Now, here's an example just to emphasize because they like to play with this a lot, okay? Not only for prolactin, but for everything else, okay? So, typically, if you want to open a door or close it, you only put in energy to go ahead and open it or close it. Okay, so your adrenocorticotropic hormone, your thyroid stimulating hormone, your follicle stimulating hormone, your luteinizing hormone, and your growth hormone, they are caused to release by their releasing hormones. So you need a releasing hormone to release them. Okay, otherwise they won't. If you've ever played Five Nights at Freddy's, you'll know that for some reason that I still never understood, you know that the battery that to keep the door closed, the battery gets depleted, which once again I never understood. This is the same concept. Dopamine is used to inhibit the release of prolactin. If prolactin is released when your battery runs out or your dopamine isn't enough, and then prolactin gets produced. Now, once again, dopamine and prolactin, they're inversely proportional. Now, what could cause an increase in prolactin? An increase in prolactin could be caused by stress, arousal, and estrogen. These three directly increase the secretion of prolactin. You could have an increase in prolactin by inhibiting dopamine. So antipsychotics or antiemetics, things that change your brain or your hypothalamus, they decrease dopamine. And like I said, decreased dopamine means more prolactin. Now, prolactin inhibits FSH and LH. So FSH, LH, until now, they are inhibiting by themselves. FSH, LH inhibit themselves. They're inhibited by the growth hormone, and they're inhibited by the prolactin. So, which leads to lactational amenorrhea. Okay. But imagine you get a patient. Okay. He has hypothyroidism. Okay. Now, hypothyroidism, thyroid is pretty much related to the TSH. Less glucocorticoids by the adrenal gland. So ACTH. Okay. Sexual functions are lost. So FH. Okay, one moment. So FH and LSH. تمام? And you get weight gain by a variety of different hormones. تمام? Now, if you get all of that, that seems to be, you have a problem with your entire pituitary. And that is actually the case. You have pan-hypopituitarism. Basically, your pituitary is smaller. Smaller pituitary causes you to just get less of everything. So less TSH, less ACTH, less FH and LSH, and less of anything that might cause you to lose weight. Okay, that's the case. So if you get a patient with all of these, it's panhypopituitarism. Now, this is more histology related, but since I mentioned everything that or things or what secretes our hormones, I felt like this would be a good revision, and they do ask about this in office, so I thought I should mention it. Now, GPA. GPA, you have your growth hormone and your prolactin are acidophilic. So GPA, growth hormone, prolactin, acidophilic. What releases growth hormone? Somatotropes. What releases prolactin? Lactotropes. Now, B flat. So all your others are basophilic. So FSH, LH, ACTH, and TSH, B flat, they're basophilic. So what they could ask you on the exam is they could point, for example, at a basophilic cell, and they could ask you what the cell name is or what it releases. They could do the same for acidophilic. Okay. Moving on to our posterior pituitary hormones, or the neurohypophysis. Your neurohypophysis, just a quick recap, you have cell bodies in your hypothalamus, a paraventricular hypothalamic nucleus, and your supraoptic hypothalamic nucleus. They produce the hormones and then they send it down to the posterior pituitary to get released. Tamam? Then, what are the hormones that get released? You have your antidiuretic hormone and you have your oxytocin. They are very similar. They are composed of 9 amino acids. Okay? These 9 amino acids, they have 7 in common and 2 distinct. Okay, so ADH, oxytocin, 7 common, 2 distinct. Now, to carry, okay, so to carry those amino acids through the infundibulum or your pituitary stalk from the cell bodies to your pituitary, you need something to help carry them. The same way, for example, I mentioned the insulin growth factor binding protein. It just needs something to stabilize it. Now, you have neurophysin. Okay, neurophysin 1 is for oxytocin. Neurophysin 2 is for ADH or antidiuretic hormone. Okay, keep this in mind. Neurophysin 1, oxytocin, neurophysin 2, antidiuretic hormone. So here's our pathway. Formed in the cell body is our hormones, ADH, oxytocin. It goes down through the axon through fast ATP channels. Now, before it gets to something called your Herring bodies, the neurophysin and your 9 amino acids or your hormone, they get separated. Okay, so they get separated equimolarly or in equal amounts. Now, after they're separated, what happens is your hormone gets stored within the Herring bodies. So your Herring bodies are electron dense bodies at the axon terminal, where your hormones are stored until they need to get released. How do they need to get released? They need to get released by calcium. Now, oxytocin has two main functions. Know this well because they ask about this a lot. Okay, like genuinely a lot. Oxytocin is responsible for uterine contractions during labor. It doesn't start labor like a woman doesn't start labor because of oxytocin. However, as the baby applies pressure on the cervical wall, you get feedback that goes back to your hypothalamus because keep in mind, once again, our hormones are getting produced in the hypothalamus in the nucleus. Okay, they go back and tell it, I need more. Okay, so more oxytocin gets released, more uterine contraction, allowing the baby to get delivered. Then you have ejection of milk. Okay, oxytocin is responsible for the ejection of milk by making the myoepithelial cells in a breast contract. Okay, very simple. So this is what I was saying. You have long loop, it goes to the neurons. So this time it isn't sending out a hormone. Posterior pituitary is very neuronal. Okay, so cervix through neurons goes back to the hypothalamus and tells it, please, I need more of oxytocin. Breast does the same. Okay, I need more of oxytocin, and oxytocin is encouraged to get released by breast suckling. So when a baby is suckling on the breast of his mother, okay, what happens is it just tells, or through mechanoreceptors, it goes back through the log loop and tells you, okay, I need more of this. Now, what is the hormone responsible for producing milk? Keep in mind, we've mentioned two things related, and I need you to focus because they also play with this. Is it prolactin or oxytocin? One, two, three. So producing milk is prolactin. So producing prolactin, same beginning. Ejecting milk is oxytocin. So far, oxytocin has two main features: contraction of the uterine muscles and contraction of myoepithelial cells. So it's contraction in both cases. Now, ADH or antidiuretic hormones. You guys took renal. You probably know about this more than I do, but I'm still gonna go over it. Plasma osmolality. So you have osmoreceptors in your hypothalamus. Okay, that detect the osmolality or the concentration of solute in solvent in the plasma. Okay, this isn't the only thing. We also have baroreceptors. So the amount of or the pressure of your blood also influences whether ADH is released or not. So these two things, the osmoreceptors and the baroreceptors, their signals get transported to the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus. Paraventricular nucleus, so these two, they determine whether we secrete more ADH or less ADH. Antidiuretic hormone helps you uh, keep more water. Okay, so it helps water reabsorption in the kidneys. So more ADH more means more water reabsorption. When would you want that? When you have high osmolality, so you have a high degree of solute, or when you have not enough pressure. So your baroreceptors are saying, okay, this is not, I need more water or I need more plasma. This is what happens. Now, if you have the opposite and your osmolality is low, you get less ADH. And if your baroreceptors are high, if you have too much pressure, you have more ADH. Now, here are things that can increase your secretion of ADH or decrease it. Angiotensin 2, nicotine, and tonicity, which I mentioned in how concentrated something is. Okay, so angiotensin 2, nicotine increase ADH or antidiuretic hormone. ANP and VNP are peptides. These peptides are released in cases of hypervolemia. So this is the same as what I explained. Just I'm telling you what gets secreted to cause ADH to decrease. So hypervolemia, we have too much, for example, plasma or pressure. ANP, BNP gets produced. It tells the body that we don't need this much water. Antidiuretic hormone decreases, and you get less water reabsorption. Okay, and ethanol also decreases. Now, if you have not enough ADH, you have diabetes insipidus. If you have too much ADH, you have syndrome of insufficient insufficient ADH. Okay, so no, less ADH or not enough is diabetes insipidus. More ADH means that we have SIADH. Okay? And thank you all so much. Please fill out the feedback form. And seriously, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me on my phone or email, which I put in the beginning of the slides. Thank you so much.